All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the Blue Sky Learning podcast entitled Let's Go to Space. I have two wonderful guests with me today. I have Mr. Karger and his lovely wife, Shirley, and they are basically pioneers in the aerospace world, especially as it relates to Canaveral in the early 60s. And we are really looking forward to having a conversation. So, uh, as you know, Mr. Karger, I threw out a few ideas that we might discuss. I appreciate your feedback. I wondered if you might share just a little bit about your life as a child in Europe and how you ended up in the United States.
Right. Um, I was born in 1933, which is the year that Hitler ascended to the chancellorship of Germany. 1939, when I was 6 years old, we lived in the southwest part of Germany, the Black Forest, in the corner between Switzerland and France. And my parents decided that the end was near at hand. They couldn't leave. There was a children's transport out of Germany, the last one out, of 500 kids that took them to Sweden. And they arranged for me to be on the transport. And so away I went to Sweden. They didn't make it. My entire family was murdered. Parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles. I'm the sole survivor of the family. To Sweden, I lived in Sweden 7 years with three foster homes and one orphanage. I went to school there. Sweden is very cold. This was within the Arctic Circle, minus 40 degrees average temperature in the wintertime, and maybe a half an hour of daylight in the winter. The Swedish educational system I found to be extremely good, highly disciplined, 5.5 days a week for school, including half day on Saturday. The teacher was a respected person of the community. You didn't go against the teacher or the paddle came out. And they did have paddles and they were used. Of course, here in the United States, that's a verboten thing. What I learned there was this: you have to work for the grades, and you have to understand what you're doing. And what I learned there is I learned how to learn, and that's a thing that went with me from then on through the entire life, through multiple disciplines, multiple industries, and multiple situations on jobs. If I didn't know it, I knew how to find out. That was the thing that I learned there, and that's the thing that I found here in the United States isn't necessarily the best thing.
Right.
Because if you know how to learn, then you can find out what you need to know to get the job done. That's what I learned.
I so much agree with you. I just want to throw in today, I call that hustle. Kids that have hustle that are I know a student, he's taken a full IB course load. He's taking the most rigorous classes at his high school, has 2 part-time jobs, has a dream of being an engineer. I don't worry about him because he's already managing his time. He's got he's got his mission. He knows what he wants to do and he is working for it. Right. But I agree with you. There's a lot of kids out there that we have, maybe we spoiled them to the point where they have very little drive to just solve the problem themselves.
Right. Now, what motivated me toward science in Sweden at that time, there was a comic strip. The title was Captain Frank, which was equivalent to Flash Gordon. And then there was Buck Rogers.
Right.
I became enamored with these comic strips. There was another one called The Brain. And was a head floating around telling the world what to do. But it was all based on science. And to me, that was a vision of the future. And that's where I wanted to be. That's what got me going toward science, space, communications, rockets, and all those sorts of things. And I might add that what I remember, and I became a fan of science fiction ever since, and that was indeed science fiction. But in my opinion, what separates science fiction of that day and today is that then it was within the possible. Today it's within fantasy, and that today's science fiction does not motivate me at all for that reason.
Um, let's see. By the mid 60s, you probably were married, probably a dad, right? But what about Star Trek? Did you watch Star Trek when it came out? And were you a fan of Star Trek?
I did watch Star Trek, and I was a fan of Star Trek because to me that was a good science fiction particularly during the early days. And yeah, it's what was within the realm of possibility. And today we have starships rising from the ground in Texas, sometimes falling back, but generally they do go up.
That's so right. So let's move a little bit forward. You come to the U.S. and if I remember reading a chapter, I think I read a book that you wrote a chapter. You met Miss Shirley was it New Orleans or it was Louisiana, right?
Almost. I was in the Air Force and at Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi, where I was going to electronics school, and she was one of the USO gals that was bused from New Orleans to the base to entertain the troops, and that's where I met her, and I met her kind of interesting because there was a dance that this was at. And I had asked her sister to dance, but the problem was her sister says I'm too short, but her sister is shorter, and so that's my wife now, Shirley, and that was in 1954, and we've been married. Actually, 1951, we got married in 54. We've been married for 66 years.
That's wonderful. By the way, it did connect with me when you said you lived above the Arctic Circle and it was really cold. Have you not lived about 60 years in Florida now to make up for that?
Almost. We got to Florida the second time. When we left New Jersey to Cocoa Beach. Actually, we lived in Satellite Beach in 1964, and but the first time. That was in 1946 when I left Sweden to the United States. And going back to education for a moment, when I left Germany, obviously I only spoke German. I knew zero Swedish. Swedish is not an easy language to learn. It's a Viking-based language. And the people that were sent to live with, the farmers out in the boondocks, knew zero German. And so I had to learn immediately. The only one who knew a little German was the church pastor who helped out a little bit. The same thing happened when I left Sweden to go to the United States, age 13 at that point. The people I was sent to live with knew no Swedish, nor than anybody in town. That was Pensacola, Florida. And I was sent there in August of 1946. Now, can you imagine going from Sweden to the Gulf Coast, which is if you want to go to hell, that's where you go in the summertime. That's hell. It's hot, it's humid, it's not good.
Yeah, I've definitely, in my previous life, I was in industry and I worked for chemical companies and I'd go up and down Panama City and Mobile, and you're right. And it's definitely desolate, probably culturally. The weather does not forgive you much in the summertime. So
I had to learn English immediately, and I mention this because, in my opinion, that's become a serious problem in the United States, particularly in Southeast Florida, like around Miami. Here, you don't need to learn English. And here, if you go to school and you hear a teacher speak in broken English, and the student comes from a house where Spanish is spoken at home, so nobody really speaks English well, and the student graduates not knowing how to read or write or speak properly. To me, that's a serious problem.
I feel like that would definitely limit their opportunities for higher education, right? So you did your time in the Air Force, and were you a trainer, I suppose, of weather radar? Did you become basically an instructor for those that use the Air Force or the Army weather radio?
Yes, I went through the basic air, aircraft electronics course, and then I went to the next level of airborne radar course, and then I went to the technical instructor school that where I learned how to teach, and that was to me very important because it taught me how to be a speaker, which I later became, and communications is key. If you know, there are people who know a lot in their head, but they don't know how to tell it. And so communication is the key to that. And so I became an instructor, and then they sent three of us from Keesler Air Force Base to Chanute Air Force Base to set up the aircraft radar on the ground and reconfigure it as a ground weather radar. And then we went through meteorology school, weather school ourselves to learn the weather business, and then we taught that for one class. It was a 9-month class, and then I went back to Keesler for the advanced radar school, and then I left to go to university.
I just want to circle back one moment. What you said is so important about being a good communicator.
Yes,
Shauna and I, the students we work with, I know Miss Shirley mentioned earlier that she had met some at a banquet and they spoke pretty, well for little kids. We actually call it the techies and the talkies. We have some kids, that really enjoy speaking. I call them the wannabe lawyers. And then I have the engineers, and engineers are notoriously poor communicators, but we bring them together and we make them practice meeting people, having conversations, knowing how to look someone in the eye and shake hands and try to get a business card. And we find that not only builds the kids' confidence, it actually is the only way that adults will take those young people seriously is if they're good communicators. That it's that important, right? Or else you just dismiss them as they're just children. Same thing with adults, right? Yes, I just so agree with you. By the way, with your radar stuff, with your radar experience, were you involved with you had to be around for the early thinking about electronic countermeasures, right? Radar countermeasures. Were you involved with any of the thinking related to, okay, how do we evade radar versus just how do we track things in the sky?
No, that was then called ECM, electronic countermeasures. No, I did not. This was strictly the radar used for navigation and
Okay.
and weather and it was also in the aircraft area, radio and navigation and gyroscopic systems of this type. But there was no ECM involved here. That was a different school, different department.
Okay. So it's let's say you were at 46 and the Panhandle, but then you went to New Jersey. Well, you did some Air Force time. You went to college, but you were married in college, correct? And were your children born before or after or during college years?
The first one was born in 3 months before graduating college. That was in 1958.
Wow. My daughter was born 3 months before I graduated. That is called motivation to graduate because I needed a job. I needed to go to work right away. So I hear you on that. So what year did you become a member of the national security team at the White House?
Okay, the way that was, it was assigned to duly to the White House and the Secretary of Defense. The location of the operation was actually northern New Jersey in Paramus, in a windowless building. That was in 1961.
Wow.
The way I came into that one was it was by invitation. It was mostly very senior government people and people from various companies like RCA Communications. Its chief engineer was part of it. Hughes Aircraft, Bell Laboratories, which I actually had worked for. And I was only 29 years old at the time. I was the youngest one there. Most of the people were retired from someplace. But I got I got invited due to some unique capabilities, apparently, and I was also at that time the youngest chairman of the IEEE Communications Group in northern New Jersey. Now, are you familiar with the IEEE?
IEEE, yes, the Electrical Engineers Professional Society.
Right. And northern New Jersey was at that time was really uh, the the Silicon Valley of its time. The people from there, particularly the three people from Bell Labs, they went west and formed Fairchild Semiconductor, and from that came today's Silicon Valley.
Yes.
On my committees were people like Alan Dumont, inventor of the picture tube. Another member on the committee was Packard of Hewlett Packard, and a few other people, pioneers of that sort. So I was the chairman of the communications group, and also I had worked in the satellite communications area, and so that was the basis of me being invited to do the communications part of that team.
Wow. Now, was your time at Canaveral before you went to New Jersey or after you went to New Jersey?
After New Jersey to Canaveral.
Okay. Quick question. I'm just curious. What frequency were the early satellites operating on? Were they in megahertz, gigahertz? What sort of band frequencies did the U.S. choose for its first satellites? I guess it was before the FCC, right? I don't know if the FCC existed yet.
No, FCC wasn't involved. I know, to be honest with you, I don't remember.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's very interesting how we fill up the air with all these wavelengths now. It's just full of noise, I'm sure. I imagine that people that if aliens were to hear all of our, receive all of our radio waves, they would think that we're just a mess with all the stuff that we're saying.
And now with 5G, we're into the E-band.
Yes. So you spent some time. I wrote it down. The AFSACS, is that the Strategic Air Command? Is that what?
AFSACS is the name I gave the system that I conceived. It stands for Air Force Survivable Airborne Communication System. And that was the system that would have been deployed in case the Soviet Union would have initially launched a nuclear attack of 100 missiles against 100 American targets. And that system was an emergency communication system with a bandwidth of 3 kilocycles.
Right.
Very narrow band.
It looks like an early mobile airborne network, right? It was
That's what it was. We used C-130s at 25,000 feet because there weren't any operating satellites at the time. So this aircraft was actually operating as a satellite would today, as a transponder.
Okay. Would you call it a bent pipe? It didn't really process the signal. It just received it and reflected it, or did it?
Active transponder, VHF frequency.
Wow. I love talking to the kids about the TDRS satellites that they sent up so we could, once we started the shuttle mission. So you started the Air Force Survivable Airborne Communication System. That was your idea. And that, I want to transition a little. We mentioned a little bit about out of the box thinking, because I think one of the things that students can do to differentiate themselves today is to be really good critical thinkers and look at problems from many directions and be as creative as they can in solving problems. So would you mind sharing a little bit about the ways that you looked at problems that were maybe unorthodox, or some of the documents that maybe guided you or influenced you to be such a novel and creative engineer?
Right. I continued reading certain kinds of science fiction, and one of them was written by Isaac Asimov, who was a biochemist actually, but he also wrote some interesting science fiction, among which was the Foundation series. Are you familiar with that by chance?
I'm not familiar with the book, but I am a biochemist by training.
Okay. But anyhow, he describe a society, a galactic society, 25,000 years into the future, and the emperor needed help, and so he got this mathematician who claimed he could influence the future using what he called psychohistory, and to me that was interesting because it actually happened in fictionally, of course, but the principles to me were working principles. If you look at a need, a requirement, and where I worked at this government group, we were very heavy on examining requirements. Requirements today, requirements tomorrow, requirements X number of years from now. This became a part of a matrix with time was one of the dimensions, and you could influence this thing. And then I read a book by Myron S. Allen, who's a industrial psychologist working for used aircraft and some other ones in the aerospace industry, and he developed a thing called morphological creativity, and in his book that he wrote, he developed a matrix where you actually laid out requirements, the technology that would satisfy the requirements, and if it didn't exist, when could it exist in time? Was it economically feasible? So that economics was a part of the matrix, politically acceptable. That was a very important part, because there are many things that people want but can't have because they're politically not feasible, and then environmentally feasible. These are all elements of a multi-dimensional matrix. So I combined Asimov's psychohistory concept with the morphology idea, and out of this I laid the matrix out, and out came the solutions, and this abstract was a solution. And for an example, part of this requirement was for the airborne command post, which was a manned airplane that was orbiting around with the general in charge, who could become the national command authority in case of a national disaster, and he would have to deliver the orders to the submerged North Atlantic submarine fleet with some targeting information. And question: how do you do that with a submerged fleet? Radio waves don't go underwater, except ELF. ELF does go underwater somewhat, but how do you do that? These are very long waves, and airplane can't possibly transmit this. So the airplane transmitted its signal to an underground facility that had a reinforced, hardened steel cover, which would retract during a nuclear attack. And up would come this electrically energized helicopter, none which existed. But I read in some German literature that some experimental helicopter were electrically operated were tested impossible. So I used that concept, and the power to the helicopter became a cable that delivered the power, and also became the antenna. And it's 1,000 feet antenna that would be sufficient to transmit the ELF signal to the North Atlantic Fleet. So that was part of the system. None of this existed, but they existed within the matrix as possibilities.
Right.
So you have to identify. You have to know what the requirements are. Then you have to identify, put possible solutions, and then you work on the solutions. Most of the time, people don't identify possible solutions. If it doesn't exist today, it doesn't exist. To me, it may exist tomorrow, 2 years from now. It depends on what the technology situation is in some time in the future. And that's part of the matrix. And that was the system I used.
Yeah, I think that's outstanding. Have you ever thought about taking on some students just to do a book club on those two books? Have you ever thought about that? I would imagine we could find a book club where you could literally just go through those books and share your knowledge with it.
Well, I've done some book lectures. We actually for 3 years I was a lecturer aboard cruise ships on a different topic. This was on Wall Street fraud.
Oh wow!
And this basically became a shipborne book club because we were selling our books along the way.
Did Miss Shirley? Did you speak on this cruise also? Did you have your own content, or did you just enjoy the cruises?
Well, I was running all around getting people to buy the book.
I see.
Sell the book, and it was very successful. We always sold out.
She's my chief editor, and
I have the same relationship with Shauna. We're reading a book called Rocket Fuel, and it says that to have a really good company, if you will, only one person can be the visionary, but one person has to be the integrator. And basically, I look at like a commanding officer and an XO. Somebody has to have that mission focus, and then somebody has to execute it and take care of dotting the I's, crossing the T's, making sure the trains arrive on time. It sounds like that's what you guys have.
Well, she also serves another purpose. When we met during my earlier days, I was a introvert.
Wow.
Very quiet.
I didn't speak to too many people. I was withdrawn, probably due to my upbringing and not the greatest early years. And however, she's an extrovert, and she's probably a marketing expert. So I learned from her, and together we made a very good team. So now I can go out and I give talks, I give speeches. I actually give three speeches at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas on investments now, different topic. But thanks to her, I'm no longer the introvert, and that's important.
That's great. Did Miss Shirley, did you have all of these communication savvy and skills when you joined the USO, or did, say, being a part of the USO, did that help give you practice or training to become the social manager type that you are?
Well, actually, my parents had immigrated from Poland, and they owned a clothing store in New Orleans. We lived behind the store. So 7 days a week, that store was open. And I was in charge of bringing the customers in. Now, in those days, you couldn't advertise. It was very hard for small businesses. So the only way was if the customer would look in our window, and I would go out and put my little hand, I was real little, I'd say, come on in, and my mom will give you some chicken soup. And do you know 90% of our customers were taken that way? So I learned at an early age, I had to go up to strangers and talk and get them in.
And
that's great.
And I did.
And she got a penny for each customer she brought in.
My dad gave me a little cigar box. So I was raised in sales and getting people, to come in the store.
She was selling refrigerators on the phone part-time after school.
That's great.
To do.
Yeah.
So the last time we met at the hotel for the banquet, you don't know this, but we got there an hour and a half early, and in the lobby, we practiced with the kids. We went through scenarios and how to talk, how to approach a group of adults, but not interrupt them, but make sure that, you wait for your moment. We literally practiced and practiced and practiced with those kids. So what you think is just them being very natural and easy for them is sort of a little bit of us practicing too. So I
good job practicing, because the first one came up, he looked to be just 6 or 7, a little bitty guy, and he was actually holding a briefcase, and he gave me his card, and I almost collapsed. I said, what's your name? So I was very impressed with the kids. I still am.
I think you guys are so right on the money about be really smart, be creative, be a critical thinker, but also be a great communicator, because your message is truly lost if you can't communicate it. So I really think I appreciate you sharing that with me. All right. I would like to transition, if I could, to a new topic. When you were at the Cape, there were a lot of rocket tests in the early 60s, right? Prior to, was it the 50s that Canaveral got started with rocket launches, or was it closer to the 60s?
It was actually in the late 50s. The Pioneers Society actually got its initial start in the late 50s. There were pioneers identified to 1959. I have a certificate. In fact, I think I emailed it to you.
You did.
They're dating back to 1959, and the first president, the founder of the Pioneers Society was Asa Gibbs, and he was in charge of what was called the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. That's before it became Cape Kennedy. And Clifford Maddox, he was the other guy. You ever heard of him, Clifford Maddox?
No, but I read what you sent me about him. One of the he was in Army Intel, and he helped retrieve the rocket scientists, I guess, at Peenemünde.
Yeah, from Brown and his team, and which were taken to a indoctrination camp in New Mexico. And one of the stories that Cliff told me personally was one time there was a meeting there, and von Braun, he was still the leader of the group, as he was in Peenemünde, launching the rockets, destroying London. He was still the leader here in New Mexico, learning English and American ways. So the people were waiting for him to come into the room, and as he entered the room, they all stood up and said, "Heil Hitler." I mean, the true story told to me by the guy who actually was there. And
I personally don't think America would have beaten the Soviet Union to the moon without the German rocket scientists. I don't know if we could have done it on our own. I only met one of the original rocket scientists. One year, about 20 years ago, I was teaching at a little church school, and I packed a church van full of kids and drove to Huntsville, Alabama. And we happened to meet Ernst Stuhlinger. Did you ever run across him?
No, sir.
He was the first chief scientist, I guess, of NASA, but he was one of the von Braun engineers. And I only met him. He was probably in his 90s, sharp as a tack, right? Telling stories just like you and I are. It was... but he's the only one. And I told the kids, they had a picture made with him. I said, you guys don't get this. This is history. You don't just meet German rocket scientists in the 2000s. So,
well, what actually happened was, you're right. When the Russians beat America into space with Sputnik 1, the United States had the Vanguard program, which was a Navy program, and that didn't make it. So it was reassigned to von Braun and his German rocket team, and all he did was take his V1 design and convert it to the Jupiter rocket system, and that is what launched the Americas satellite up. It was really the adaptation of the V2 rocket, which was a liquid fuel rocket.
Yeah, and maybe you were aware of this. I was doing some reading, and that at one time, von Braun favored really heavy, sturdy rockets, but somebody in the Air Force wanted to use really thin metals and then pressurize the containers. But there was like a debate about structurally what was the better choice. And when I read about things like that in history, I'm thinking, how awesome is that? They had to figure that out. It wasn't known yet what was the optimal path, things like that. I'd like to ask you, when you worked at Cape Canaveral, were you monitoring? You were an electrical engineer, I presume. Were you involved with the communications or some other aspect? Were you like the ground hardware type guy? Were you on the receiving? Were you receiving signals? What was your role? And did you enjoy that time? What are your memories of being at the Cape in the 60s?
Well, when we first moved to Cape, to that area from New Jersey, I had an offer from Radiation Laboratories, which has now become Harris Corporation. Harris something else, and for the purpose of working on the microcircuits, space for space applications. That didn't last too long because I learned early on that the only reason they hired me was for the contacts I had in my previous life, and I went to the work not to be be bled of what I knew and then dumped, which is what I was expecting what would happen. So I ended up working at Pan American Airways in the communications planning department that laid out which took the requirements for the missions, for the launches, the rockets, the satellites, and all the test jobs, making sure that there was adequate communications in place downrange around the world. So
that's right. It was like Australia, and there were Navy ships positioned, right? Where there weren't land masses, you just use Navy ships.
In the Indian Ocean, they were around the world, and so that ended. It ended in a very interesting way. Actually, the department was canceled, and with that, everybody gets laid off. So right at that time, I was the chairman of the IEEE there, and I had just gotten an award as an outstanding man of America for the work I had done before up in the Washington area. And so here I get laid off. I asked myself, how can this be? But it was. And so somebody offered me a job working on the crawler tractor for the Saturn rocket system. And my job was to identify parts that would be damaged during liftoff, and so they could be replaced. And that didn't last too long because that's not a job I was interested in.
Right.
So I got offered to go to Eastern Airlines to restructure its antiquated engineering department, which I did. And then I became the person who did the work on future aircraft programs. And so I was actually the one who led the industry effort in vertical and short takeoff landing aircraft and evaluated the American version of the supersonic transport, the Boeing version of 225 passengers. And I was the one who wrote the report that nixed the project.
Oh, wow.
And the reason was it was not allowed for that aircraft to go transcontinental because of the sonic boom, which
was
uneconomic.
You know, by the time you took this Eastern Airlines jobs, that sounds like a very heavy on communication type job. You must have been full on extrovert by then, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you sound like a manager of people and programs. You don't sound like the guy with his head down on a bench with a soldering gun, or you sound like you were managing people by then.
I was always a systems person, not a component person. The kind of person who looks at requirements and fits them into a system that works. But that's a systems orientation. It takes a different mindset. That job was finished, so I was offered another job to go back to Washington into the aerospace, the defense complex. I had a friend who was the director of communication policy at the White House. He offered me a job, but the weather was nice, the sun was out, and we didn't want to go back to the snow and ice. So we stayed. And so what I did was the work I did for this military job, and I should mention that my direct supervisor was a reassigned associate director of the CIA for communications. He was my boss. And so the network we laid out was, in my opinion, directly applicable to a transportation network. Communications and transportation have similarities. You have nodes, you have hubs, you have the size of the pipes, you have a lot of similarities. Passengers, instead of hertzes, go through the pipes. And so I, myself, one person, transferred that technology and developed a model to forecast the company's revenue for 125 stations and the corporate side. And it worked, and I became the manager of this for 15 years. And so there's a transfer of technology that had developed before in aerospace. Now it's in the airline industry.
Okay.
And so I was there for a total of 20 years, actually.
That's very interesting. Okay, here's where we are in the conversation. I wanted to ask both of you. You know, I work with. I'm the old guy in class. The kids are 40 years younger than I am. I literally have T-shirts that are older than the students I teach. So, what advice? You guys have seen things come and go. You've seen fads. You have a tremendous wealth of experience. The future STEM workforce, the kids that want to be scientists, engineers, doctors. What, and this question is for both you and Miss Shirley. What would you recommend? What would you share with them if you could only give them a few pieces of advice? What is most important?
If you have a problem to solve that requires the plug-in of data into a calculator, don't do it unless you also know why it works, what the calculations mean. For example, when I went to university, we didn't have a calculator, we had a slide rule. And so you have to know how to do it. You have to know if you do a Fourier analysis, it's a mathematical kind of analysis, you have to know how the waves flow in your head instead of plugging in numbers on the keyboard and out comes the answer. Because if you do that, your creativity is lost. So that's the message I would offer students, to know why you're doing what you're doing instead of just doing it because the answer comes out.
Well, my advice is to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask, because a lot of these so-called very bright kids, sometimes they put on a different face, and in reality, they're afraid to ask a specific question. Don't be afraid. Ask as many questions as you want, and just don't hesitate, and try to listen very carefully. If you don't understand the answer, ask the question to someone else, but never stop asking.
That's great, both of you. We have the kids. Sometimes I work with kids that are they're gifted, and they would rather not say anything than sound dumb or not feel like they failed. But I tell them you can't have pride when we're doing things like a satellite. There's no end to what I don't know, and we got to find the right people that have the answer. So I try to look at it like we're going to fail. We're going to fail fast, and we're going to try to learn from every mistake we make. So I always, I totally get that. I always encourage my kids when they're meeting people or they're being interviewed. I always say, and I'll ask you guys, what is the one question I should have asked you, but I didn't? What do you guys think I should have asked you, but I didn't today?
That's a good question.
I know, right? Because sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And if you were on this side, what would you have asked yourself?
I would have asked, at your age, knowing a little bit of what you're doing, but not everything, because I'm involved with a lot of things. Why do you do what you do at this time, at age 88? Why do you continue doing these things? That would be a question.
Gunther, why do you continue to do what you do at this age?
I do because it's my philosophy, and this is what I tell kids when I speak to them. No matter how difficult a task may be, do the best you can with what you got. Because if you do that, tomorrow, if you have a problem, tomorrow the problem would be less of a problem, and you would be closer to the solution if you want on a project. But always do the best you can, because if you think it's impossible, the ship doesn't leave the dock and nothing happens. Do the best you can. And in my case, what I want to do is share the essence of the experience that I have gathered over over time from different situations, and relate today to history. One example, just last week, I wrote a report that went out to my readers. I have a distribution that compared the Munich Putsch of 1923 to what happened on January the 6th, 2021 in Washington at its capital. What is the historical relationship? Well, I have the historical knowledge to tell that. And so long as I'm alive, I will tell that. And so that's what drives me as long as I'm around, as an example.
Oh, I read your letter, and it was spot on. So I read that. So thank you. All right, Mr. Gunther and Miss Shirley Karger, I want to thank you so much for taking a few minutes to just have a conversation that I know my students, our listeners are going to enjoy. I'm gonna sign off now, but again, we can't thank you enough. I look forward to hopefully seeing you when we all get our vaccinations and we can go back to having gatherings, at least safe and social and fun gatherings. But thank you so much for your time, and you guys are wonderful, and thank you.
Our pleasure.